So Brandy has a few of the 2024 State of the Interconnection, the printed reports in the back, and they may already be all gone. If you haven't had a chance, this is also online. This is an awesome document. It's amazing. I took it to a dinner party last week because I was like, this is what I do. All my friends are like, what do you do? I don't know. You just travel all the time. This is what I do. This is amazing. But I bring it up because there's a section in here on security and specifically physical security and the increasing threats that we have in the Western interconnection. Brady's with us here today, and I know he could talk for 2 days about physical security. We probably could have all spent 2 days just talking about physical security. But in the next 60 minutes, he's going to talk to you about how we can best prevent, detect, and respond to this risk. So welcome, Brady.
Right. Hello, everybody. Last presentation of the day. I think the mentality there is I can't possibly ruin this conference too much by being the last one there. So we'll get started. What we're going to be talking about today is holistic physical security. And point of that being, so how can we look at the 3 physical security standards that we have, be it low impact, CIP 6, and CIP 14, and put them together in a holistic approach to where they support one another. And whether or not you have all 3 of those, maybe you just have low impact, there are methodologies in the other standards that help the other standards, like as an example, CIP 14, there's principles within there that have followed in the low impact standard could help enhance that program as well. And it doesn't mean that we have to spend all of the money that we might spend normally in CIP 14 in low impact to achieve that, but it'll help out as well. So excuse me when I figure out the first time how to do this. There we go. So every presentation will have a what we will learn and why it matters. And I talked about the holistic security strategy approach as well, but I also want to talk about understanding the framework of physical security. So we're going to dive briefly into the standards themselves. I don't want to sit up here and read the standards to you guys, but we're going to touch on them real quick, just so we have a baseline understanding of what we're talking about. And then shout out actually to WCIF for giving feedback on wanting to see more audit approach, wants to learn about what we've been seeing in the field. So we're going to cover that as well. And that'll be a big portion of this presentation. Thought I had it figured out. So we've already gone through the welcome there, but we'll go through the agenda here. So we're going to do that introduction to physical security standards. We're going to have the WEC audit approach explained, the holistic physical security principles, including integrating NERC CIP standards with industry best practices, developing comprehensive security plans, and the importance of proactive and adaptive security strategies when we're implementing these standards. Finally, we'll get into real-world findings and lessons learned from all the time I've spent on the road looking at physical security across just about, I think I've hit almost every entity now. But with that, we're going to have to move pretty quick. I got a lot to say in 60 minutes, and I definitely want to make sure there's time for question and answers. It's one of my favorite parts of being a presenter, is being able to talk to you guys. So we'll burn through the overview because I'm sure most of us, if we're applicable, we understand the language. But essentially, low impact establishes the requirement for a documented cybersecurity policy that addresses the security of the bulk electric system and the cyber assets critical to its reliability. CIP 6 mandates the implementation of PSPs, or physical security measures, that protect cyber assets within the identified PSPs. And then CIP 14 is the physical protection of critical facilities. When I say CIP 14, I want to also be clear that I'm particularly talking about R4 through 6. I don't deal in the R1 through 3 space. So let's jump right into audit approach, right? So, in low impact, we have to have a documented plan, and that plan needs to be based on need as determined by you, and where we're protecting the cyber assets themselves or the locations that they're in. So the cyber assets themselves that generally are in the field looks like the cyber assets within a control house of a substation or the substation full perimeter itself. So you can approach it either way. Verify implementation is a big part of the audit approach for physical security and low impact. So we're going to come out and we're going to look at making sure that we've achieved the objective of protecting those cyber assets, either at the facility level or the asset level. And what that might look like is, the security objective being that protection, having the access based on need, going out there and looking at make sure that we have barriers in place, we have some kind of access control between us and the critical assets, or the cyber assets, I should say, and also verifying whether or not you're protecting them at the asset level or the site level. So CIP 6, we're going to jump into auto approach here. Everything's going to have a documented plan here. Obviously, we have to document, and we do verify that the documentation has been completed. And for 1.1, we got to verify if one or more documented plans exist, and then the implementation of that plan. And that'll all roll into 1.1 through 1.10. So it's a lot of documentation review. But also with our 1.2, we need to make sure that the PSP has at least one method of physical access control, be it a badge or whatever it might be. Generally, we see badge swipes. And also we need to verify that only authorized individuals have access there, right? Or unescorted access. And how we generally do that when we're on site is we're going to have a badge that shouldn't work and we will swipe it. And if it doesn't let us in, you've met the compliance there. 1.3 gets a little bit more controls associated with it. We need to make sure that it has 2 controls. And generally what we see there is a badge and a pin, or a badge and biometrics. And again, we will test it and make sure that if I swipe a badge and put a pin in, that I make up that I can't get into your PSP. 1.4, again, verify that you wrote a plan for it. And the implementation of that and the verification that we make is we ensure that monitoring for unauthorized entry is happening at that PSP access point. What that generally looks at, so we look at the records of who's been in, who's been out, any kind of alarms. That tells us, step 1, that you are monitoring. The other part would be to have discussions with your security control center or your grid operators or whoever may be monitoring for those alarms and alerts. 1.5 is essentially telling who is getting those alarms. So we need to confirm that people are actually getting them within 15 minutes. And that would be associated with the cybersecurity incident response plan. I want to take a second and actually read this one because it's important that we verify that an alarm or an alert is issued in response to detected unauthorized access. Detected is important there because the PACs will send the alarm on any kind of door open too long, door held, or door forced, but that doesn't tell what is actually happening. It's saying in the system that something is unusual. The detected part is whoever's on that plan needs to be able to create to start an investigation to find out why that alarm occurred. So we'll be looking at your process in your documented plan for how you're going to be looking at that. And then also we need to look at the cybersecurity incident response plan that will indicate who on that plan should be getting the alarm. And most often, if there is a security command center, we will see that the SCC is the one that is listed in the cybersecurity incident response plan as those. That makes it really easy to be compliant because right off the bat, the individual that gets the alarm first, you've already met the language of the standard because they're part of the cybersecurity incident response team. If not, then that needs to be clearly delineated on who that monitor will be reporting to within 15 minutes of detected. Again, it's not the alarm coming through, it's after the investigation. So it's a clear delineation there. Oh, thank you. Was I getting you in the eye? Okay. So we'll go to 1.6 and 1.7 are similar to 4 and 5 to where we need to verify the plan exists and we need to make sure that those PACs also have alarms and alerts on them, the PACs controllers themselves. So 1.6 is monitoring, 1.7 is responding to that alarm and investigating it. However, an important thing to note that in CIP 6, 1.6 and 1.7, we do have a guidelines and technical basis that says if those PACS controllers are located within the PSP, then they are afforded the protections of the PSP access points and don't particularly need the controls themselves. So as long as those PACS controllers are residing within the PSP, they're good. Oftentimes we will see redundant features where these PACS controllers will have tamper alarms on them, and that just demonstrates a more advanced approach to CIP 6 and usually gets higher marks. 1.8, what we look for here is that we're looking for logs, be they paper or however you're doing them, mostly electronic. We want to make sure that we're making sure that those authorized with unescorted access have their identity, date, and time details of entry. 1.9, simply we look at 90 days of logs to make sure that those are all filled out and looking good. So it's a lot of evidence review there. Not much I can do on site with that one. And then 1.10 is I have a love-hate relationship with it because it's part of my standard. However, I don't understand it very well because it has logical controls built into it as well. So what that looks like on site, if I were to come see you, if you have anything traversing external ESPs like cabling, then I will ask, does that traverse the PSP? If you say yes, I'll say, does it have any kind of physical protections on it? If you say no, I'm going to go ahead and just boot it over to CIP 5 and be done with it. Fun part about that too is pretty soon that should be moving over to CIP 5, so I don't have to deal with it anymore, which is a good thing. Because logical controls don't seem very logical to me, but I'm a physical guy. So let's move into real quickly. CIP 6 is a long one. We got R2, right? So we got visitor management. So really what we're looking for is that we do ensure continuous escort for unauthorized individuals within a PSP. What that usually looks like and how we verify it is I'm an unauthorized individual. I should not be allowed to go into your PSP alone. So I look at how you escort us, and generally entities are doing very good at this, maintaining eye contact, no more than 5 visitors per escort, things like that. So that's what we're looking at when we're walking around your PSPs testing them. 2.2, so we look at the logs, whether paper or electronic. So as we're looking at the logs, we're making sure they're filled out accurately and that everything is there. What we do provide a little latitude that if something is missed, because human error is probably the biggest threat to R2, is that if a log's missed, if you have systems in place like cameras where you can review video, you can look at who that escort was, see that they were continuously escorting, saw that the visitor had left when they were supposed to, everything was good, but you can go back and just fill that log out and say, hey, we missed it, but we're going to go back and correct it through investigations. We allow that. Our 2.3, we verify that those logs are retained for 90 days. So we'll look at that and make sure that we have at least 90 days of that in your system. Generally, electronic records make the process a little bit more seamless. Moving on to R3, maintenance and testing. We ensure that PACS and PSP hardware devices are maintained and tested biannually for proper functionality. That'll be the documentation side. However, when we're doing our site tours, how we test that is really through our R1 testing, where we're producing alarms on site. So we're testing that I can't get into a PSP, that if I force a door, it is sending an alarm. If I am holding a door, it's sending an alarm. So essentially, we're running a PACS maintenance and testing plan as we do our site tours. And then jumping over to CIP 14, again, I'll review evidence and evaluation to verify that it considers, when we're looking at R4, the threat and vulnerability assessment. We want to make sure that you are looking at potential threats and vulnerabilities as described in requirement 4. One of the things that I look for in CIP 14 is, do you know the difference between a threat and a vulnerability? Sometimes we don't. So a threat is somebody like a person with a gun. A vulnerability to your critical facility would be the ability to attack critical components at that place. And there's a hill right next to my substation that is above my fence line that allows me to see all those critical components. Threat being man with gun, vulnerability being the hill. So I want to make sure that we're making that clear delineation when I'm doing my documentation review. Also site tours, I'm looking for things like that. In 4.1, we're looking at unique characteristics. We're looking at the potential threats and vulnerabilities and how the site's unique characteristics will foster the information or develop the information within. So there are certain sites where ballistics might not be a threat depending on the makeup of the site. Generally, we see that at primary control centers. Everything is housed within brick or very big buildings that, ballistics just has no effect on it. However, substations will be different. So we're looking at how the unique characteristics will develop your threats, and also the unique characteristics of the site itself, like where it is, how many hills are around it, avenues approach, so on and so forth, will develop that unique characteristic. 4.2, we are looking at prior history of attack. So how do you consider history on similar facilities, taking into account frequency, proximity, and severity? How is that shaping your unique characteristics and your threats and vulnerabilities? We want to make sure that we're not just listing prior attacks, that these are actually feeding the information into how you're developing your threats. And we'll get a little bit more into the details of that soon. So 4.3, what we look at there is how you're using intelligence or threat warnings from law enforcement or other sources to develop those threats and vulnerabilities at your site. And that'll mostly be through documentation review there. Okay. Our 4 key takeaway that I wanted to add here was that we need to make sure that we ensure comprehensive threat and vulnerability assessments by incorporating prompts from 4.1 through 4.3. 4.1 through 4.3 is designed to be working together to shape the threat and vulnerability itself. It's not a byproduct of the threat and vulnerability, meaning we don't come up with our threats and our vulnerabilities first and then apply 4.1, 2, and 3 to them. 4.1, 2, and 3 should help us develop the threats and vulnerabilities themselves. Our 5, we'll jump into that. So we need to verify that physical security plans, 1, are done 120 days after R2, and then we also need to make sure that we're including all of those 5.1 through 5.4 measures and that they're implemented correctly. 5.1 is the big one. So it's deter, detect, delay, assess, communicate, and respond. So we need to evaluate the collective design of your resilience and security measures to make sure that the threats and vulnerabilities that we've identified in our 4, that our DDACR actually meets the intended, it meets the effectiveness of the standard, being that they're effective to be able to reduce and mitigate the threats. Mitigate does not mean completely eliminate, it means lessen the impact. And that's what we look at. 5.2, I'm not try to read that, but essentially what we're looking for here is the law enforcement contact and coordination information. I'm going to go into what we've been seeing in the field as far as discrepancies there. But essentially, you need to use law enforcement contact and coordination to support your security measures and resilience to make sure that we are mitigating the threat. 5.3, another long one. But essentially, we need to have a timeline for executing security enhancements, and we need to make sure that they're clear, realistic, and they adhere to the intent of the standard being to mitigate threats. 5.4, a process needs to be developed to be able to evaluate evolving threats and their corresponding security measures. Again, we'll talk about discrepancies there as well. I would say 5.2 and 5.4 right now in CIP 14 are where we're having the most discrepancies when we're auditing entities. But essentially, we need to have the ability to stay abreast of what's happening in the industry through our intelligence sources to see what kind of threats are changing in the industry, and then have the ability to know how to mitigate those changing threats. CIP or R6, that's the unaffiliated third-party review. We need to make sure that you have that review done, and it covers our 4 and our 5. 6.1, what we look for is, are they qualified? Do they meet the criteria that is specified in 6.1? And then for 6.2, I'm making sure that it's done within 90 calendar days of the completion of R5. And then 6.3, reviewing non-disclosures and all of that legal paperwork. Getting that done. How do I go back? I got confused there for a second. There we go. Our 6.3 is actually recommendations. So how are you taking recommendations from your unaffiliated third-party reviewer? And are you accepting them and making the changes within 60 calendar days of them making those recommendations? Or do you have a good justification why you don't think that they're applicable to your site? And then the next one, 6.4, is that non-disclosure and confidentiality. So we'll look at those, make sure they exist. The next section I want to move to is how to prepare for an audit. I know I saw a lot of new hands come up. Maybe some of you have not experienced a WEC audit before. So I wanted to touch real quick on what a physical security audit looks like and some of the expectations that we may have seen in the past and the reality that we are currently in. So expectations sometimes is an adversarial audit. Entities often anticipate a confrontational audit process. But in reality, it's a collaborative and educational experience. In physical security audits, when I'm on site, I try to be professional, organized, and purpose-driven, and I focus on sharing best practices with you guys and education and outreach. The primary function is to make sure that we're meeting compliance, but whether we do or not, we move into an education and outreach and best practices conversation. And I think that's important. Expectations, strictly formal procedures. Really, when I come on site and you do audits with me, it's really a dynamic interaction. We do the offsite reviews of evidence to prepare for coming on site with you, but then also once I'm there, it's not this official sit down, you're across the table from me and I conduct interviews and I grill you with questions. We're gonna walk and talk about everything that you've got going on and seeing it in real time and having discussions about what we see when we're on site and we're testing your physical security functions. So focus on compliance. Primarily, we are there to make sure that you are compliant. However, as stated before, we're really looking at that holistic approach. While compliance is key, auditors also assess the effectiveness of implemented security measures, ensuring entities are not just only compliant, but also effectively secured against threats. That's where the outreach, education, and best practices come into play in our conversations as we're doing our site tours and walk and talks, is how can we take what's already good and make it better and continuously grow together. So with holistic security principles, I kind of came up with this write up on what I believe it means to NERC CIP, and I'll go ahead and read that. Holistic physical security principles in the context of compliance with NERC CIP physical security standards encompass a broad and integrated approach to ensuring the physical security of the BES. These principles are designed not only to meet specific regulatory requirements, but also to promote a comprehensive, adaptive, and resilient security posture that protects against physical threats and vulnerabilities. So what you're gonna hear a lot of is how when developing holistic physical security, it's gonna sound a lot like it's above and beyond the minimum language of the standard. And to develop a holistic physical security profile, you would be doing that. However, keep in mind, I have not forgotten what the minimum language of the standard is, and I will hold entities to that. However, if we have the opportunity to talk and grow your program together, that's what I'm looking for in holistic physical security. So the integrated security framework. In low impact, what we're doing is it emphasizes the importance of managing security as an integral part of the organization's broader security framework, especially in cyber systems. And we need to apply the appropriate security controls for those sites that house those assets. And the holistic approach, or the principle for that, would be to ensure that physical security measures are not siloed, but integrated into the overall security and risk management framework of the organization, promoting a unified approach to protecting critical infrastructure. So sometimes low impact, because there's oftentimes entities have so many of them, they can get siloed. There's no standard language that requires something like monitoring. So your security command center might not be getting alerts for them because they don't have to have that. However, we need to make sure that in a holistic principle that we're bringing them into it, the overall, monitoring. I'm not saying you have to monitor. What I'm saying is making sure that we're not forgetting about them as far as, there's a lot less requirement for physical security in the low impact. than there is for something like CIP 6 or CIP 14. CIP 6 is more of a defense in depth approach. So, CIP 6 will focus on the implementation of physical security measures to protect the BES cyber systems around a PSP. And the holistic principle here that associates what it's like with CIP 6 would be the defense in depth approach. So we want to make sure that, what CIP 6 does is it ensures that we have multiple complementary controls and barriers in place to protect those critical assets. Risk-based priority setting is the holistic security principle for CIP 14. So we need to make sure that we prioritize the protection of our critical facilities based off the R1 and R2 work. And the holistic principle for that means that we're emphasizing the importance of assessing risk, employing layered defenses, and adapting to evolving threats, prioritizing based on risk. So developing comprehensive security plans for low impact. We want to make sure policy and documentation is on point. So we need to craft detailed cybersecurity policies that comply with low impact standards, focusing on the protection of those low impact BES cyber systems. Access control measures. So we need to implement those access control measures to manage physical access to the BES cyber systems. Most importantly, because it's based on need, we need to define the roles and responsibilities for those personnel granted access and making sure that it's based on need. Training and awareness. When we're thinking about how we improve our low impact program by using some of the other holistic principles from the other standards, we can develop and maintain a comprehensive training and awareness program for all personnel with the access to those systems, emphasizing the importance of cybersecurity and the specific requirements of low impact. Risk assessment and mitigation. We can perform risk assessments on our low impact sites to be able to identify what they might be vulnerable to. Thinking CIP 14, but not money of CIP 14. When we're thinking about what's the risk to what are our threats and vulnerabilities to our CIP 14 sites, you can do the same for low impact. And you can think about how somebody might be able to breach that facility and get in and cause destruction. The same can be applied to low impact as well. And then risk assessment, mitigation, the mitigation measures of deter, detect, delay, assess, communicate, and respond can absolutely fit into low impact as well. Smaller sites, less security requirements, but that's a good lens to be able to look at it through. Moving on to the comprehensive security plans for CIP 6, defining and securing PSPs. One of the best things you can do is clearly define the boundaries of your PSPs to include all critical cyber assets, implementing the barriers and showing us through documentation how the PSP works and all the controls that are in place. Surveillance and monitoring systems. Obviously, we have to be able to monitor and survey for unauthorized access into the PSPs. Make sure that we're doing that. Visitor management protocols definitely fall into CIP 6 as well. Testing and maintenance. We need to make sure that we're doing that biannual testing and maintenance of the packs associated with and associated hardware, card readers, alarms, and barriers to verify their proper function. Having a good comprehensive maintenance and testing program. And then we're integrating with cybersecurity. That whole 1.5 part really blends physical security into the cybersecurity world, and we need to make sure that we're paying attention to that. The security plans that we're looking for in CIP 14, that detailed threat analysis that we're doing in R4, how we're responding to those threats and in real world events, making sure that we're touching on that. The law enforcement coordination is a big part of that because generally response, that R part of the DDD-ACR is law enforcement is primarily the most effective response to an attack on our facilities. We need to make sure that we have that coordination piece down. And then timeline execution and timeline management, having realistic goals to improve our physical security posture is important. Realistic, I mean, I understand and I remember what it's like being at an entity and trying to get things done as far as physical security goes. So auditor judgment, but if you say I need to hang a fence and it's going to take me 6 years, or not hang a fence, but hang a sign on a fence, then that's probably not realistic. However, if you need, I'm going to put up a fence, a specific anti-cut, anti-climb fence, and it might take me 2 years due to budgeting and resources, that's definitely realistic. So we look at that as well. And then the dynamic evaluation and revisions. So as we have unaffiliated third-party reviewers come through, evaluate our work, we evaluate our own work, we need to be able to have the ability to adjust and grow with the evolving threats of our industry. Proactive and adaptive strategies, part of the principles of holistic physical security. We need to be able to anticipate emerging threats. That's a key part of CIP 14. However, we can do the same for CIP 6 and CIP 14, or CIP 6 and low impact. Enhanced security postures. A proactive and adaptive approach allows continuous improvement in posture for all those physical security standards. Compliance and resilience. Adapting to shifts in regulatory requirements and threat landscapes is essential, not only for compliance, but also for building resilience. Alarm management and response. Having the proactive strategy for alarms ensures that potential breaches are not only detected swiftly, but are followed by quick, well-coordinated responses. This is a principle of CIP 6. Visitor management, the R2 of CIP 6, is important to be able to have advanced visitor management techniques. Examples could be electronic logging. Paper logs work. They just add a little bit more risk to your profile because of human error. And then the proactive maintenance and testing, being able to stay on top of what's happening there. Moving on to CIP 14. Continuous threat intel is important. Threats are always evolving. We need to be able to have a system in place and people in our processes that are able to stay up to date on what threat intel looks like. Adaptive physical security plans, you have to be able to change your plan based on evolving threats. And then proactive UTPRs, unaffiliated third-party reviews. We need to make sure that we're engaging with unaffiliated and independent third-party reviewers with a proactive approach to evaluating plans, allowing for the identification of improvements. A very important part of evolving our strategies. All right, so the fun part, the real-world findings and lessons learned that we've had from common audit findings, challenges, and gaps, what we're seeing in the field. So challenges I've seen in low impacts entities often provide vague policies, such as stating they will grant access based on need without detailing the underlying process. What does based on need mean? That's a common question I'll ask. Identify gaps. So the lack of detail fails to specify the procedural steps an individual must undertake to be granted necessary access, leaving the process open to interpretation and inconsistency. Best practices we've seen at audit. So document the full access request process within the security plan, clearly outlining initiation of access requests, the roles responsible for processing that request, be it security, facilities, whoever it may be, the criteria for determining access necessity, the method of granting access, and regular reviews of granted access to validate its continued necessity. By incorporating these best practices, entities can close documentation gaps, clarify access protocols, and enhance their compliance with NERC CIP 3 low impact. Okay. Challenges in physical security. Entities often lack comprehensive access management plans, specifically in the management of physical keys. A lot of low impact sites will have hard keys and not very much for key management plans. So we need to make sure that we, the reliance on traditional hard keys and padlocks without detailed key management can leave low impact assets vulnerable and security measures unforeseeable. Best practices we've seen at audit: key assignment tracking, access level definitions, key duplication control, regular key audits, and lost key protocols. Incorporating these practices into a key management plan can significantly strengthen physical security and regulatory compliance. Common audit findings for challenges in physical security. Entities often fail to test site protections adequately before audit team visits. So pro tip, if you know I'm going to be coming to your site, make sure we don't have a hole in the fence when I get there. Oversight and alarms, perimeter security, or procedural adherence are frequently uncovered during effectiveness testing by the audit team, which could have been preemptively identified and rectified. So best practices we've seen: scheduled pre-visit testing, routine effectiveness checks, audit preparation drills, immediate remediation procedures, and documentation and review. By implementing these, we can make sure that we don't show up to a site and Brady sees a hole in the fence. Yep. So another challenge would be failing to conduct comprehensive unique characteristic evaluations. This one touches on CIP 14. It's a big one. Security assessments will often look like physical security assessments, not unique characteristic evaluations. Meaning, we'll see that R4 looks like this is the fence we have, this is how big our site is, these are the cameras we have. But that doesn't talk about how unique the site is from an outside perspective of, if I'm a bad guy, what am I going to use about the terrain, the environment, your neighbors, your customers to be able to affect an attack against you? So we need to make sure we're looking at that. So the best practice we've seen is detailed facility profiling, contextual threat analyses, stakeholder consultation, being the people who work in that site, and regular review and update. It is amazing when you go into a control house at a CIP 14 site and you talk to the operators who work in there every day and you say, how would you take this down? And they answer the question, and it's pretty effective. So that's a good question to be asking your operators. By integrating these best practices, entities can ensure that our security assessments account for each facility's unique characteristics, and all that's going to lead to a more effective plan. The next one would be relying solely on generalized threat information. This one touches on looking at the EISAC list, throwing it in your plan, and not using it to develop your threats or vulnerabilities. I've seen them all. I've seen them every single audit. I know what they are. Tell me how that you're using that information to shape your threats and vulnerabilities. Best practices derived at audit: customized threat analysis, rational threat prioritization, dynamic threat assessment process, and continuous learning and adaptation. By integrating these best practices, we can make sure that our security assessments fully account for realistic threats against the unique characteristics of our sites. Inadequate response timeline development. Again, CIP 14. Entities often implement security measures without properly analyzing or testing their effectiveness in real-time scenarios, leaving uncertainties in their capacities to mitigate threats within actionable timelines. This one touches on deter. We don't really have a timeline to measure how well you're deterring. If they don't show up, hopefully it's because you're deterring them. However, our clock does start when we get to detect. Once we detect a threat, we have a time interval that takes how long can we delay them, conduct an assessment, communicate the threat, and get response out there to mitigate that threat. And if the timeline is for the attack to be successful is shorter than the response, then we have some work to do. So we need to look at it from the principle of, this is how long it takes a bad guy to do their thing. This is how quickly we can respond to it. And if the response is quicker, then we're in a good place. Best practices derived from audit is realistic threat simulation, detailed response, timing analysis, adaptive security adjustments, continuous testing and documentation, and compliance through preparedness. By adhering to these, we can make sure that our measures that we put in place in 5.1 are effective. Inappropriate selection of third-party reviewers in CIP 14. Not all professionals holding a CPP or PSP certification may possess the specific expertise required for CIP 14 reviews. We need to make sure that we're vetting our unaffiliated third-party reviewers, not just meeting minimum compliance of, yes, they have a CPP or a PSP. Doesn't mean they know what they're talking about. So best practice we've seen is industry peer consultation. Talk to your other entities and make sure that you find out what worked well for them, who got good remarks in an audit. That's probably a good place to start. Review historical performance of that unaffiliated third-party reviewer. Understand non-compliance consequences. That one really comes from recommendations that maybe an inexperienced unaffiliated third-party review might be giving you a lot of recommendations that might not necessarily have anything to do with CIP 14. However, if they make the recommendation, you have to do something about it. So we want to watch out for that. Build a networking community. I know WEC puts together the physical security work group. There are lots of other places that you can go to meet U2PRs and other entities that have had success with them. And then assess the reviewer's independence. By following this, you can make sure that you have actually an effective review of what you're doing. So real quick in closing, so key takeaways. So we need to make sure, when we're ensuring compliance across CIP 3, CIP 6, and CIP 14, we have rigorous documentation, regular testing of security measures, and adaptation based on findings. This approach secures not just compliance, but the resilience of physical security systems against evolving threats. Customizing security to asset specifics, tailoring security strategies to the unique aspects of each facility covered by the different standards, understanding the specific vulnerabilities and threats to low impact assets, PSPs, and critical transmission facilities enables more effective and targeted protective measures. Continuous improvement and collaboration. So we all have a culture of continuous improvement and sector-wide collaboration. We need to share insights between the WEC and our entities, learning from incidents to enhance physical security measures. I think that's collective wisdom approach, working together through a collaborative function. I've seen success with that in our physical security audits. Got through it. I had an hour. So open to questions. I encourage them. The usual suspects.
Troublemakers.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jenny Weick from Tacoma Power. I'm also the WCIF New Standards Implementation Focus Group Chair. So my question is kind of both from Tacoma Power and also the role with new standards. I hope you're not surprised by this question because I think I've asked it before. We just want an update on this. Do you anticipate any changes to CIP 14 applicability criteria to include the adjacency topic of physically adjacent, separately owned? Particularly, the interest is changes regarding if you have a facility currently not applicable, is that going to change in the new CIP 14 revision because you are adjacent to another applicable substation?
Yeah, that is a very important question. I've had FERC in the room with me during audits observing. I've had leadership at NERC, and nobody will answer that question for me either. So I don't think anybody knows yet, is the short answer.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
But currently in audits that you're performing, you're not looking for entities to look at that adjacency prior to the risk assessment, right? That isn't going to opt you into CIP 14 just because you have a substation that's adjacent to another one.
Help me out here.
complicated
Is that an
question.
R1 question? That sounds like an R1
That is
question.
an R1.
I don't do R1. I'm sorry. I'm sure there's somebody around in here that does, though.
Okay, maybe future WEC workshop presentation.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, I get told where to go, and then I go do our 4 through 6. Yep. So I have all the faith and trust in our R1 auditors and the work that you're doing to identify your critical facilities. So I trust that, and then I just go audit the physical security.
Jenny, I can say a little something. Hi, everyone. Tom Williams. This has been a fun couple of days. Thank you. I am not an R1 expert, but I know a little bit, and I know there's an amazing practice guide on R1. All the regions participated in it, and the adjacency topic is handled straight on. I don't think it answers your question specifically. It's more from the other point of view, from the entity that already has. Yeah. So question noted, and I'll do what I can to follow up with you, but sorry, we don't have an answer today. Okay, thanks, Jenny.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Joshua Mann with Western Area Power Administration. I'm not sure if you could answer this in an official capacity, maybe, but in terms of communication sites, do you ever see them receiving a sort of low to medium or any sort of requirements that may be coming down the line in the future to be proactive with?
I haven't seen it, but it makes sense that, let's just say it's going to take, as it is usually in this industry, it'll take an event. And if we ever have an event, then absolutely. But as is right now, I'm not hearing anything about that.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. What I've been waiting for all week.
Now you're in trouble. Nick Weber with Archer. One of the questions I've got, and I kind of a loaded question, but have you seen a correlation between the entities that include physical security in their CIP 8 and their performance on low impact CIP 6 or CIP 14 on their exercises?
Yeah, definitely. Some of the higher performing entities are incorporating low impact into their CIP 8 response programs, or their cybersecurity incident response plans. I definitely think it indicates a maturation in evidence, for sure. Especially, I'm not saying, I can't say I've seen it recently, but we did have history in the 6 years that I've been here, where that connection between 1.5 and CIP 6 and the cybersecurity incident response plan wasn't clear or wasn't happening as often as we're seeing it now. I think through outreach audit, and we've been seeing an increase in that. And as we increase our low impact audits, knock on wood, hopefully, then we'll be able to see a growth in that arena as well. Yeah. There we go.
Hi, I'm Vincent Medina from Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And my question is, what does realistic threat simulation look like for a high-performing entity?
So realistic threat simulation, it's taking into account the 4.1, 2, and 3 that is shaping the development of the threats and vulnerabilities. And then once you've developed those threats, red team drills, it would be a good example of that, is acting as the threat that you've identified and seeing how your vulnerabilities are susceptible to that type of attack. I'm not saying identify ballistic and shoot at your substation. However, I'm saying, pretend to breach, test your security staff, see how they respond, work with law enforcement in the coordination piece, and see and develop those coordination plans to make those the responses more effective. So that threat model would be take our threat and test it every way that we can to make sure that it's, one, realistic, and two, that we can actually mitigate the threat.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, first of all, thank you very much for a great presentation. And I think note to REC staff, REC management, I think this is what SMEs are looking for, right? Examples of what we can do, best practices, lessons learned, and so on and so forth. And the second question, Jenny asked about this physically adjacent, separately owned substations. What about physically adjacent, separately owned control centers? Are there any thoughts? I mean, you don't have to answer it right now because you said I'm not a CIP 14 guy, and this is neither CIP 14 nor anything else. Maybe Tom can look into it. Thank you.
Yeah, it looks like NERC is jumping in to provide some insight.
It's always a scary thought. No, so that question is one that we addressed in the report we sent to FERC on CIP 14, and it was one of the what I'll call ambiguous points that we called out in CIP 14. So there is a SAR that has been approved, that drafting work has started, and one of the points called out in the SAR, specifically requiring clarification, is how should adjacent substations be considered in the R1 assessment. And so yes, there is no answer right now because it was determined to be something that needs clarified in CIP 14, and that drafting work is ongoing. So if you're curious how that's playing out, I would encourage you to follow along with that CIP 14 drafting team.
So you said adjacent substation. He was particularly talking about control center. Is this the lowercase control center conversation that we've been having a lot as far as how it's a lowercase in CIP 14, but not anywhere else, so it's not technically defined.
It could be that one I'm less familiar with.
Okay. Say again. Uppercase. Okay, there we go. Anything else? All right, there we go. Thank you for letting me present on audit approach and CIP 14 and kind of some of the things we've been seeing in the field. Appreciate it. Yeah, reach out anytime. Similar to Morgan, I take questions anytime. So anytime you want to talk physical security, it's the best part of my day job. So there we go. Thank you.